France, December 1944. The winter air slices through the shattered windows of a makeshift field hospital somewhere near the Ardennes. Snow drifts silently through the holes in the roof, melting into puddles beside the stretchers lined against the wall. The muffled echo of distant artillery hums like a heartbeat of war that refuses to die down. Inside, U.S. Army nurses move between rows of wounded men, Americans and Germans alike. Their khaki sleeves are rolled, hands trembling not from fear, but exhaustion. One nurse kneels beside a German officer, his iron cross glinting faintly under a flickering lantern. His uniform is torn, soaked in blood and mud. She does not flinch. With quiet focus, she threads a needle and begins stitching, not his wound this time, but the shredded fabric of his uniform. Around her, silence. The officer watches in disbelief. He had been taught that enemies humiliate, not heal. But here, in the cold heart of battle, the enemy is sewing his dignity back together. This was not a story of weapons, but of hands that healed where bullets had torn. The year was 1944, a decisive, merciless chapter in the Second World War. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy 6 months earlier, tearing open Hitler's fortress Europe. Now the Western Front stretched across France and Belgium, a landscape carved by shells, mud, and shattered towns. The Allied push toward Germany was gaining ground, but every mile came at the cost of blood. Behind those front lines moved an army of healers, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Over 50,000 women had volunteered to serve in uniform, trading the safety of home for tents and trenches that reeked of antiseptic and smoke. They were trained not only to treat wounds, but to survive under fire. Their hospitals were not marble buildings, but canvas shelters pitched in frozen fields, sometimes just a few miles from combat. These nurses lived through the same chaos as the soldiers they tended. Shells landed close enough to shake the surgical tables. They treated men whose boots were still caked in the soil of battle, some missing limbs, others too broken to speak. There were no shifts, no guarantees of rest. Each day was an unending rotation between life and death, between the groans of the wounded and the silence of the dead. The U.S. Army medical system had evolved rapidly during the war. From mobile evacuation hospitals to frontline aid stations, it became a logistical masterpiece. Within hours of injury, a wounded soldier could be carried from the battlefield, stabilized at a clearing station, and transported to a field hospital staffed by doctors and nurses. Here, the nurses were the bridge between survival and loss. But as the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, they began to face a new reality. Enemy wounded. German soldiers, sometimes entire groups of captured officers, flooded into American medical camps after major engagements. Many of them had grown up under propaganda that painted the Allies as barbaric, soulless invaders who would show no mercy. To these prisoners, surrender often meant humiliation or death. And yet, when they entered Allied hospitals, they witnessed something that defied every lesson they had been taught. The American nurses did not turn away. Under the Geneva Conventions, the U.S. Army was required to treat prisoners of war with the same medical care as its own troops. But what shocked many German officers was not the legality, it was the humanity. For the nurses, these men were not Nazi officers or Wehrmacht soldiers in that moment. They were patients, flesh and blood. Their duty was clear. They cleaned their wounds, stitched their gashes, and even mended their torn uniforms to keep them warm in the harsh winter. These small acts were not gestures of pity, but discipline, a reflection of military professionalism and moral conviction. Historical accounts from field hospitals during the Battle of the Bulge describe scenes of unimaginable tension. Trucks arrived loaded with wounded from both sides, the line between friend and foe blurred by blood. American nurses, often outnumbered and undersupplied, worked for hours on end. In one recorded report from a field hospital near Bastogne, a German officer expressed disbelief that he had been given morphine and clean bandages. He reportedly murmured to a nurse who only replied by tightening his bandage and moving on to the next stretcher. These quiet moments of mercy carried an unspoken power. They were not acts of weakness, but of strength, reminders that war, no matter how mechanized or ruthless, still left space for conscience. The nurses' discipline was their defiance. Yet, behind the calm professionalism, each of these women bore private battles. The faces they treated were often enemies responsible for the deaths of men they had tended the day before. Compassion in such conditions demanded a kind of courage no battlefield medal could measure. Still, they endured. Each needle threaded, each wound closed, each torn uniform mended, became a silent stand against the dehumanization that war demanded. In the bitter cold of Europe's winter, these nurses were the fragile warmth between life and despair, between hatred and humanity. And soon that humanity would meet its ultimate test when a group of wounded German officers was brought to one such field hospital and discovered an enemy unlike any they had imagined. By late 1944, the Western Front had become a landscape of exhaustion. The German army, though retreating, still fought with a grim determination born of desperation. The Allied advance into Belgium and Luxembourg met fierce resistance, and hospitals behind the lines overflowed with the wounded. Among these hospitals were the evacuation and field hospitals, operated by teams of American doctors, orderlies, and nurses who lived in conditions few civilians could imagine. Their wards were tents, their tools sterilized in boiling water, their lights powered by small generators that sputtered during bombardments. Supplies ran thin, yet the flow of patients never stopped. In such places, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps became a symbol of hope and a moral mirror of the war itself. Many of these women had come from small towns in America, teachers, secretaries, or homemakers before the war, now transformed into professionals capable of handling catastrophic injuries with calm precision. They operated in mud, snow, and blood, with hands often numb from cold, faces pale from exhaustion. Reports described them improvising with torn bedsheets for bandages, melting snow for cleaning water, and using thread from their own sewing kits when surgical supplies ran out. These resourceful acts became stories whispered among soldiers, tales of the angels in uniform who somehow made order out of chaos. It was within this environment that one of the war's most unexpected encounters unfolded, when captured German officers, some still wearing their medals, were delivered under guard to American medical stations. These men had been schooled to view surrender as dishonor and enemy mercy as myth. They expected interrogation, perhaps even execution. But what they found instead were nurses kneeling beside them, speaking softly in foreign accents, offering water, and disinfecting wounds with the same care given to Allied soldiers. For many of these German officers, the cultural shock was profound.
The Nazi military ethos had long glorified hardness, the idea that compassion was weakness. Medical staff in the German Wehrmacht treated their own with loyalty, but rarely extended empathy to captured foes. To see American women dressed in olive drab, tending to their injuries, and even stitching their torn uniforms by hand, felt almost incomprehensible. One German prisoner later recalled his astonishment in an Allied interrogation report. "They fixed my jacket so that I would not freeze. I had believed such things impossible from an enemy." He would later admit that the experience had shaken his understanding of what the war was truly about. But the nurses did not act from ideology. They acted from training and a deeper sense of duty that transcended uniform colors. Their professional